today from University of Vermont. Unfortunately, she's not here in person, but she's virtually connecting with us and hopefully pretty close. She can kind of see a little bit of you guys. If you have any questions, the microphone here can maybe pick it up or let me know and I can jump in as well. Any questions before we get started from anyone?
Is this presentation
Did you hear that, Abby?
No.
There was a question whether this presentation would be saved and uploaded to YouTube.
Well, fingers crossed. I just turned the recording on. So if all goes well and there's no technical gremlins, yes. But you're not allowed to leave. So you have to stay.
Yeah, so hopefully this one will be. Any other questions?
Fingers crossed. That's the plan.
on YouTube or the college website or?
Yeah, this would be at the Proctor Maple Research Center YouTube channel.
Okay.
Other questions before we get started? All right, I'll turn it over to you, Abby.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, Adam and the New York Association for having me today and for making it possible that I could be there remotely. Really wish I could be there in person, and I'm glad to see you all. It is really nice to see you. So today's talk is going to be kind of wide-ranging. This is basically focusing on practices to maximize our yields over the long term. So these are practices so that we can optimize both sustainability and yields, because those things are really tied intimately to one another. All right, so let's get rolling here. And before I start, especially with this talk, it's really important for me to say that I'm going to talk about a bunch of different research projects and data. So it's not just me doing this work on my own. This is work done by lots of different people at the Proctor Center, Dr. Perkins, my colleague Mark Islehart, our intrepid technicians, everybody that supports the work that we do. So just because I'm up here talking doesn't mean that I did all this work. God knows that would be insane. Okay, so to kind of set the stage here, each year when we make a tap hole to collect sap from the tree, a couple of things are happening. The tree's response to that tap hole wound is going to end up generating a column of wood that is permanently non-conductive. And that is non-conductive to water flow for the tree, but also, of course, for sap collection if we were to tap into that area again. So we're generating non-conductive wood. And of course, we're also removing a portion of that tree's carbohydrate reserve. So we're taking something out from the tree that it would normally use. On the flip side of that, every year the tree is going to add new conductive wood to the outside of itself through new radial growth, diameter growth. And so when we talk about sustainability and sustainable sap collection, an important question to step back and ask is, what the heck do we mean by sustainable, air quotes? And there are a lot of different definitions of what sustainable means. And so we have a little bit of flexibility there, or it's kind of it's in some ways a philosophical question. But one way we can define sustainability, especially when we set up the scenario, like we have it here in this very basic way, one way that we can define sustainability is that when we have the addition of that new conductive wood outpacing the amount of non-conductive wood that we're generating through tapping. And of course, kind of hand in hand with that the volume or the amount of conductive clear wood in the tapping zone of the tree remains pretty high over time. In other words, the opposite of this. Just intuitively looking at this cookie here, we pretty much know that if we tap into that tree, we're not likely to get very good yields. And so if we meet this definition of sustainability, what this does is gives us sort of sustainability from a tree health perspective. So meeting these conditions means that we're going to have a tree that has good functional water transport to get, to survive and get water up from the soil into the leaves. And also a relatively low risk of disease and decay, because of course, the more non-conductive wood that we have, the higher the chances that that tree and those wounds are going to develop more widespread disease or decay. So that's sustainability from a tree health standpoint. And then, of course, it's also sustainability from a maple production sap yield standpoint, because if we have lots of conductive wood, we've got a high probability of hitting clean conductive wood that's going to have good sap yields when we tap into that tree. So this kind of hits sustainability from both of those perspectives. And the important thing to kind of set the stage here and keep in mind is that by framing it up this way, what this shows is that radial growth, the diameter growth rate of the tree, is what underlies the sustainability of tapping practices, both for tree health and for yields. So radial growth rates really underlie everything. And of course, tree health affects tree growth rates. And so you can see that how this kind of builds and sort of cycles back on itself. Okay, so with radial growth rate being so important, the first question we want to ask is, what do we know about the impacts of tapping and sap collection on tree radial growth? And so one of the first studies that we did at the Proctor Center to investigate this question, we just wanted to find out, well, what are the growth rates of trees out there that are being tapped with sort of our more modern current sap collection practices? So practices like high vacuum and really good sanitation that allow us to get at least 0.4 or greater gallons of syrup per tap. So what we did, and this is like the shortest version synopsis of this study ever, but what we basically did was take a whole bunch of increment cores from over 800 healthy trees that had been tapped with a single tap, were co-dominant or dominant in the canopy, from 6 different diameter classes in stands across 18 operations that had relatively high yields for the past at least 5 years when we did that study. And from those increment cores, we measured the annual ring width, basically the annual radial growth rate, to calculate that growth rate over the past 5 years that those trees have been tapped with those relatively high yield collection practices. And so again, the very short version of the story, these are the annual growth rates that we found for the radial growth rates that we found for the average of all those trees across those 18 sites in those 6 different diameter classes. And in and of itself, this data, well, it's interesting, but not really. It doesn't really tell me much about whether those growth rates are sustainable for a sap collection or not. Are they good? Are they bad? Just on their own, they really don't tell us much. So in order to provide some kind of context for, are these growth rates good enough for sap collection to be sustainable, what we did was we used this model. We actually developed a model of the tapping zone that estimates the amount of conductive and non-conductive wood in the tree over time based on the tapping practices and growth rates of the tree. And we use this model to estimate what are the minimum growth rates required to maintain a relatively high proportion of conductive wood in the tapping zone. Remember, that's one of our threshold for sustainability. To maintain that high level over time with sort of standard tapping practices. And in this case, we were using basically the practices outlined in the 2nd edition of the North American Maple Producers Manual. And it was essentially a 2-inch tapping depth, a 5/16 diameter spout, and 30-inch drop lines. And what we found was, if we sort of married those two things together, our measured growth rates here are again here in the orange color, and the minimum growth rates that we estimated for trees of those diameter classes are here in the blue. So what you can see, broadly speaking, is that our average growth rates that we found of trees out there being tapped with these high yield practices generally were higher than those minimum rates that we estimated that they needed to be to maintain that threshold, that low bar of sustainability. So broadly speaking, that was pretty good news, that generally speaking, trees out there being tapped with high yield practices had decent enough growth rates for tapping to be theoretically sustainable for yields and tree health in the long term. So yay, we can put a smile on our face. However, remember that these 6 orange bars are the results of data from about 800 trees. So there's a lot of data that is going in to make this one bar. And when we kind of pull apart the data that make up those averages, we can see that the story when we look at individual trees is not quite as rosy, and it's varied, which is kind of what we would expect. So these are actually the average growth rates at each of the sites. So here's our 18 sites, and here's the 6 diameter classes. So what we can see, even when we look at just the averages for the 18 sites instead of overall, we can see that there's a lot of variation in the growth rates of trees just between site to site. So just looking at sites A and B in the 10-inch size class here, those growth rates are double of one another or half of one another, depending on how you look at it. So a lot of variation in how trees grow. And you guys all know this. You know this from looking in your own woods. So when we ran the analysis, instead of on the average growth rates, but actually looked at the growth rates of all those 800 individual trees in the study, we found that between 27 and 41% of those individual trees had growth rates below the minimum estimated that we needed to maintain that high level of conductive wood, that condition for sustainability. And again, that's with using the 5/16 inch spout, a 30-inch drop line, and 2-inch tapping depth. So big picture is pretty, happy and comfortable and reassuring. The picture for individual trees, of course, is more nuanced than that. So file this away for a moment. We're going to come back, kind of circle back to this at the end. So what else do we know about this? Well, one thing about that study, it was a great study and it gave us some good information. But when we try and look back in time to understand the effect of tapping and sap collection on growth rates, that strategy has a lot of limitations. If we really want to know how tapping and sap collection is going to impact, or does it impact, radial growth rates of trees, we actually really need to conduct an experiment where we start off with all equal trees that have never before been tapped, and then treat some of them. So tap some of them and leave some of them as controls, and basically eliminate and control for as many variables as possible that would affect tree growth rates by having everything in the same stand and making everything equal. So in order for us to kind of provide some additional data, what we did was we initiated a study to do just this. This is what we call our long-term study. And we have a single stand of trees, all in the same location. They're about 100. They had never been tapped before. And we segregated them into 3 treatment groups. We had a third of them that were left as controls, never to be tapped. A third of them that are tapped annually with basically buckets and bucket collection, so gravity sap collection methods. And then the other third are tapped and sap collected with high yield sap collection practices, so high levels of vacuum, very good sanitation, etc. And all the trees are basically, the treatment groups are equivalent for, they're healthy, they're equivalent in diameter. So everything is kind of accounted for that, or as possible, everything is accounted for that could impact growth. So we measure not only how much sap and syrup equivalent that we extract from the treatment trees each year, we of course measure their diameter growth rate each year to see, are tapping and sap collection actually impacting radial growth? So we began this way back in 2013. It has been kind of a long time, sort of, in some perspectives, since we started. So we've been collecting data since 2013. And what you can see here are just the diameters, the average diameters of the controls, the gravity trees, and the vacuum sap collection trees each year over time. And so kind of just looking at it broadly from a big picture, you can see that generally speaking, the trees are growing, and the trees in the different treatment groups are growing very similarly. looking at this just overall from starting point to now, so from 2013 to 2021, if we look at the percentage of growth from where those treatment groups started, on average, our gravity sap collection and control, our untapped trees, have grown about 14.5% in terms of basal area since the beginning. And our vacuum sap collection trees have grown 13%. So there is a difference of 1.5 percentage points. However, that is a teeny tiny difference. And from a statistical point of view, that difference does not exist. So from a statistical perspective, from how we actually analyze these data, these numbers are not different. So there is no significant difference at this point in the growth of our vacuum at gravity trees compared to our untapped controls. However, this is not a 10-year study. This is likely more like a 20-year study. We don't tap trees for 10 years and walk away. In maple production, we tap them for 30, 50 years. So it will be important for us to continue to follow these trees and how and if their growth is affected, to see whether this non-significant difference now becomes more statistically significant and biologically significant over the long term. So to be continued, but after 8 years, I can't do the math, 2013 to 2021, so far, there is no difference in the growth of trees that are tapped, whether it be with high vacuum or with gravity sap collection methods. Okay, just to look at this, to highlight a little bit more data from this study, because it's kind of fun to look at, and B, it kind of shows us some other things about how trees grow and how trees are growing in parts of the Northeast right now. So these are just the annual percent basal area increments. So the annual growth of each of these treatment groups on average. And you can see that they really do closely mirror one another in the different treatment groups over time. And we have some years where the vacuum treatment group is growing better than the gravity, and some years where that's the opposite. So you can see, especially because we see that back and forth between how the treatment groups are growing each year, that is part of the reason that is part of what tells us that right now there's really no difference in how they're growing. But also very interesting to see that particularly in the past couple of years, these trees have not been growing very much. And this is not greatly to do, at least in this stand, with crowding, for example. The trees are fairly free to grow. This reflects more the conditions on the ground. Drought, we've had a lot of dry years. These years have been dry. These years have been hot. They have not been terrific years for trees to grow, at least in northern Vermont, where we're located. So just something to keep in mind, especially as many of us experience that very low sap sugar content in the past season. You can begin to get an indication of what set the stage for that. Conditions that lead trees not to grow very well are also conditions that are likely to lead to lower than average sap sugar concentrations. So again, that's just kind of an aside. And then one other way to reflect how these trees are growing, this is the annual difference in the basal area increment of the gravity and vacuum trees compared to the control. And so you can see again, some years the trees are growing better than the untapped controls. Some years they're growing less well. Yes, that did make sense. Anyway, you understand what I mean. But on average, over the course of the study so far, our trees tapped with vacuum sap collection have a 0.18 percentage point lower annual basal area increment than our untapped control trees. So that's not 18%, that is 0.18%. It's less than 1%. Each year. So it is, 1/10 of a percent basically. So again, not a significant difference, either statistically or really realistically at this point, it doesn't reflect biological significance. Okay, so that's a lot on that. So other information that we know about tapping and sap collection and their impacts on radial growth, a study done by our colleagues in Quebec found basically in that study, no consistent relationship between growth and tapping, but there was an indication that if there is a relationship, that it's often probably mitigated by soil fertility and how good the soils are. And that finding really highlights one of the limitations of our long-term study at Proctor, because that is just one site. And of course, all sites are very different and likely have an impact on how trees respond to tapping. So in order to help improve our understanding of how tapping and sap collection impact radial growth, we expanded that study beginning in 2017 to do a long-term controlled experiment at 15 different sites across Vermont and New York. And again, we were beginning with untapped trees that had never been tapped. And at each of these sites, we have a set of trees that are tapped with high yield collection practices, trees in the same stand, very closely matched, that are not tapped. And so we measure annually the diameter growth and the crown condition. So far we have funding to go through year 6 with this, and hopefully we'll continue, and hopefully with the really generous participation of the producers that are volunteering their trees for this, which is amazing. Hopefully we'll be able to continue that in the long term like the other study. So far, similar to the results of our site just at Proctor, we find no significant difference in the growth of tapped or control trees across those 15 sites in any of the DVH classes that we're using. So again, so far, all of the data from our experiments are not showing a significant impact of tapping and sap collection on radial growth. Okay, so all that said about growth rates, how do our tree growth rates, the tapping practices that we choose, the yields that we get, factors related to the tree, and sustainability, how do these all interact in a way that we can make informed decisions about what the best practices are to maximize our yields in the long term? And so first and foremost, no news flash here, this is not rocket science. Our tapping practices impact yields. We all know that, but what I believe it helps to do is to actually put some numbers on how much our tapping practices impact yield, because if we can quantify that, we can make a more informed decision about how to balance the practices that we choose. So first up, in terms of tapping practices, and probably one of the most impactful practices on yields, is tapping depth. And of course, all of us know from practical experience, generally speaking, deeper tap holes result in greater yields. However, when we actually study this, what we see is that there's a limitation to where that relationship holds true. And so we took a close look at this recently, a 3-year study from 2018 to 2020. We were comparing different tapping depths and the yields of those depths. And how I presented the overall data from the 3-year study here is as a function of a 1.5 inch deep tap hole. So how do the yields compare of deeper and shallower tap holes relative to that 1.5 inch deep tap hole? So firstly, you can see that going to a 1 inch tap hole results in a fairly sizable reduction in yield. So on average, 1 inch tap holes yielded about 60% of a 1.5 inch tap hole. So that's a fairly sizable reduction. Then as we move deeper than 1.5 inches, you can see that yields improve. But when you look at scan from 1 3/4 inches to 2.5 inches, you can see that that number basically flattens out to about 25% more. So going deeper than 2 inches is likely not going to get you much, if any, more sap. Some of that has to do with the anatomy of the tree and the anatomy of wood. Some of it has to do with, it's kind of hard to make a clean, good tap hole. It's not, doesn't just have to do with where non-conductive wood is, but drilling deeper holes is actually can be more challenging to do a nice, clean tap hole that will be nice and tight. So anyway, yes, deeper tap holes result in greater yields, but going to 2 inches based on the results of this study, going to beyond 2 inches probably doesn't buy you much in terms of extra yield. So that's helpful to know. Then of course, tap hole diameter is also going to impact yields. And again, we intuitively expect that a larger diameter tap hole is going to make or produce more sap. What we see when we actually study this in comparison is that essentially if all things are equal, so same spout materials, equal attention to leak and leak checking, we see about a 10% reduction going from a 5/16 inch spout, for example, to a 1/4 inch spout, and about the same rate of reduction as we go even smaller in diameter. So a 10% reduction there. And what's interesting is, so this is work that we've done at the Proctor Center. Work done at Center Acer found essentially exactly the same difference. So in 2 years of a study, they found 1 year was 9%, 1 year was 14.5%. So on average, they found an 11.5% reduction going from 5/16 inch to 1/4 inch. So again, that is, it's important that having that number gives us information to make decisions with. And then of course, the last tapping practice that can have an impact on yields is the number of taps per tree. And we've taken retaken a closer look at the data from this to try and get good quantitative numbers on how much you actually get when you're adding that extra tap. And the results have been, I don't want to say surprising, but I would say they're more nuanced than I think we generally tend to think about how the number of taps can affect yields. So the first year that we did this study, we found that adding a second tap generally gave us about a 20% increase relative to just a single tap in a tree of the same size. But when we repeated it the next year, because of course, doing a study for 1 year in maple production just really isn't enough, because years vary so much in terms of the impacts of various treatments on the yields that we see. And so in 2020, we found basically no improvement in yield from adding a second tap, which was a little bit, it was a head scratcher, of course, at that moment. So because we had happened to do this study on some red maple trees that were available at that time, which we didn't really think was likely to have a great impact, and we still don't necessarily do. But because that was an odd result and we were doing it with red maple, we decided to go ahead and repeat that study again with sugar maple and some of the same red maples to see, do we see the same patterns with sugar maple? Do we see, is it different than red maple? So it actually ended up becoming a little more complex than we initially intended. So the third year that we did this with just sugar maple, we found something close to 2019, about a 30% increase. And we're repeating this upcoming season. Oh my gosh, it's already 2022. So we'll hopefully be able to have a better picture. But for now, I think what this highlights for us is that yield can increase with adding a second tap, but it's not always the case. It's definitely not double. That's just if you're on buckets, maybe it's double, but not using high vacuum. And importantly, that the higher the vacuum we have and the smaller the tree diameter that we're trying to squeeze that second tap onto, the more reduction in gains you're going to see. Did that make sense? So higher vacuum and smaller tree diameters reduce the gains from adding that extra tap, because both of those conditions basically promote the cannibalization of sap from one tap hole to the other. And you can kind of see that in this graph, these are yields from 1-tap trees and 2-tap trees. So you can see as the tree diameter increases, the benefit of adding that second tap increases. And again, with the kind of levels of vacuum that we're using, that makes even more sense because the smaller the tree is, the more likely that second tap hole is going to be affected by the vacuum from the first tap hole. Okay, so we know that deeper and larger tap holes, more taps per tree up to a point, at least theoretically equal higher yields. But at the same time, we also know that all of those practices are going to lead to more non-conductive wood. So tapping practices also impact how much non-conductive wood we have. And how much, again, putting a number on things is helpful. Generally speaking, the volume of non-conductive wood is going to be proportional to the volume of the tap hole. Bigger hole, more non-conductive wood. So deeper, wider, more per tree, you're going to have proportionally more non-conductive wood from those practices. How much is in, it varies. It is highly variable from tree to tree, but on average, we tend to use a number of about 50 times the volume of the hole. And that is a big, broad number. You can see that in this study that we did, this was looking at about 50 trees, the average was 50 times, but the maximum was 200 times and the minimum was 14. And these are all for clean tap holes that had not intersected with other non-conductive wood, which generally results in way more non-conductive wood. These are clean tap holes. So, we have trees that make a tap hole wounding column as small as this. These are 2-inch diameter cookies going up and down from the tap hole. So you can see that by 4 inches and above and 4 inches below, there is practically no stain visible. That tree compartmentalized that wound extremely effectively. However, this is pretty rare. I love this, fun to look at, but not what we see most often when we cut up trees and look at them. More often, we're seeing something like this, where going above the tap hole at 12 inches above, that stain is still present, so it's not even fully gone. And then below the tap hole, the same thing, 14 inches above, I'm still seeing signs of that tap hole. This is a little bit more typical of what we see. And again, these are clean tap holes. This is when you start to see something like this, where the wound response of this tap hole has started to interact with this already present central column of non-conductive wood, then there's no holds barred. That tends to explode the amount of non-conductive wood made, which is another reason why having a lot of conductive wood and not so much non-conductive wood is also hugely important. The more of this non-conductive wood is there, the more likely this is going to happen, and the amount of non-conductive wood you generate from a single tap hole is going to be much bigger than what it would be normally if it was just a nice clean tap hole. As we can kind of skip these. This is just a picture I'd like to throw in here. You can't see the central column of discolored wood in here. It got cut off from this slab, but these two tap holes, their wound response still interacted with something, that non-conductive wood, that was very distant from where these wounds were made. So just because you don't see non-conductive wood when you drill a tap hole, doesn't mean that those things aren't going to interact within the tree. So it's just something to keep in mind, especially when you're thinking about tapping smaller trees. Okay, let's skip that. So putting this all together, we can see, or we will be able to see, that tapping practices impact not just the amount of non-conductive wood and our yield, but the chances of hitting non-conductive wood when we tap. And so how we can kind of put this together, if we think of the tapping zone of the tree as the area of the tree that is accessible by the sap drop line, if we just take that area and unfold it from the tree, you can see that it is basically just a 3-dimensional rectangle. and it is a 3-dimensional rectangle whose dimensions are defined in 2 dimensions by practices that we choose. So obviously 1 dimension is defined by the tree size, the circumference of the tree. So we control that by choosing which trees we tap, but more directly, the other 2 dimensions of the tapping zone are determined by how long we make that drop line and how deep we decide to tap. And these things multiplied together determine the total size or volume of the tapping zone. And that means that it is the maximum potential amount of conductive wood that we have available. And our tapping practices control at least 2 dimensions of that, and really 3 if you think of it in more of a big picture. And of course, we already just talked about that our tapping practices determine how much non-conductive wood we add each year. The bigger the hole we make, the more non-conductive wood is going to be added. And so if we put all of that together, we can see that the proportion of the tapping zone that is non-conductive, from all of those accumulated columns from our previous tapping, is actually equivalent to our chances of hitting it when we tap. So for example, if 20% of the tapping zone is made up of non-conductive wood, we've got a 20% chance of hitting it when we tap and an 80% chance of hitting conductive wood. So as non-conductive wood accumulates over time, the chances of hitting it increase. And as we said before, the diameter growth of the tree underlies all of that, because it's going to determine how much conductive wood is added to the outside of the tapping zone each year. And in doing that, it also determines how much of the pre-existing non-conductive wood grows out of the area accessible by our tapping depth. So basically, some of this existing non-conductive wood will grow out of the tapping zone as new conductive wood is added to the outside of the tree. So it determines, the tree growth ultimately determines the proportion of non-conductive wood and conductive wood present at any given moment, and therefore the chances of tapping into either one. And the reason why this kind of comes full circle and is the thing that we're talking about, thing that we're concerned about, is that tapping into non-conductive wood impacts yields. And again, this is something that we intuitively know from putting holes in trees, but having actual numbers to put on this are not just helpful, but in this case, in my opinion, very impactful. So this study that was done by my colleague, Mark Islehart, UDM's Maple Extension Specialist, he intentionally tapped into previous tap hole wounds to non-conductive wood and compared the yields from those tap holes to tap holes that were drilled into conductive wood. And what he found was that on average, tap holes drilled into non-conductive wood yielded 75% less sap than tap holes drilled into clean wood. So tapping into non-conductive wood, our chances of tapping into non-conductive wood are hugely important, because the greater the chances we have of hitting it when we tap, the greater the chances we'll have fairly significant reductions in yield. And it's yields which we're aiming for in the first place. So some other factors to consider in this big picture, an important one is tree size. Now, we all, again, intuitively know that yields tend to increase with tree size. And from our research and research done by others, we can roughly estimate that with vacuum and good sanitation, all things being equal, we see about a ½ pound per inch increase in yield. But of course, there's a huge amount of variation there. But I think the thing that I like, so number one, the bigger your trees are, the higher your yields are going to be. And when you're thinking about which trees do I want to include as crop trees versus maybe doing some thinning, the thing to think about with smaller trees is that first and foremost, of course, their yields are not very good to begin with. There's not a lot there to provide sap and sugar. But there's more to that based on kind of putting together what we've just talked about. In a small trees, the relative percentage of non-conductive wood in the tapping zone increases with decreasing tree size. So a tap hole is going to make about the same amount of non-conductive wood, whether it's in a 24-inch tree or a 4-inch tree. And because small trees have much smaller tapping zones, that non-conductive wood is going to accumulate much, much faster than in a bigger tree. So very rapidly, you have the chances of tapping into non-conductive wood increase much more rapidly in a small tree relative to a larger tree. And now, you know, it's not just, it can be less drastic than this, but this is an example of kind of the shenanigans that can happen when you're tapping small trees sometimes. But in addition to that, you know, small trees having that stacked against it, smaller trees that we include as crop trees sometime or find in our sugar bushes, a lot of times they're not in the main canopy. They're not dominant or co-dominant. They're below the main canopy, what we call intermediate or suppressed trees, trees whose crowns are not getting a whole lot of sunlight. These trees have much lower growth rates than their co-dominant and dominant neighbors. So if you add that into everything that we just talked about, of course, those slower growth rates are going to make worse their already more rapid accumulation of non-conductive wood. So tapping small trees has a lot of things stacked against it that can maybe make doing some forest management activity a little bit more attractive and appealing in that case. So how do we put this all together? So really, again, the idea here is to choose tapping practices that are going to maximize our yields in the long term. But when we say that, when we're aiming for yields that are maximized in the long term, what we're trying to do and what we need to do is choose tapping practices that balance, yes, the yields that we want to get in the current year, but we need to do that as a function of the accumulation of non-conductive wood in that tree, as a function of how well it's growing, how big it is, how much non-conductive wood is already there, because ultimately, as you've just seen, this is going to determine future yields. As the non-conductive wood accumulates, the chances of hitting it are going to increase, and the chances of therefore reduced yields increase. So tapping practices to maximize yield for me is really you're aiming to optimize yield. Optimizing yield and sustainability in the long term is ultimately going to lead to maximize yield in the long term. And so how to put this into practice, first and foremost, you need to know something about how well your trees are growing and how much non-conductive wood is already there. And this is actually reasonably simple to do. For your trees, for their growth rate, you can take a subsample, you can mark a location and monitor the diameter of those trees over time. That's a really simple, kind of quick and dirty way to do it. You can get fancy and establish permanent plots, get help from your forester. That's a great way too. But you don't have to be too fancy to do this. And then in addition, it is very, very helpful to estimate how often you hit non-conductive wood when you're tapping. So is it 5 out of every 10 tap holes? God, let's hope not. Is it 1? Is it 20 out of every 100? You know, some estimate will really give you a lot of information on which to make decisions. So before taking any step at all in terms of tapping practices, before anything, you're going to want to put into place practices to promote the growth and, of course, the health of your trees. And in many cases, that's going to be some kind of thinning or stand improvement, forest management, things that promote the growth rates and health of your crop trees. In some areas where it's needed, this may include things like liming or other soil amendments, but that is it's very important to note that this is only relevant in a place that actually needs it. So You need to have a soil test to know whether this is important for your crop trees. And then other best practices, things like taking good care of your forest soils, putting in good roads that are going to treat your trees well, and lots of care when you're doing logging or thinning. We see a lot of damage to crop trees by very careless thinning. I mean, it happens, but it is something to think about when you are doing work in your sugar bush, to really, really do everything you can to take care of those trees. And so after that, though, the main sort of the name of the game is to choose and then subsequently adjust tapping practices for the current year that are going to balance the accumulation of non-conductive wood and the yield that you want to ultimately get with the growth rates and existing non-conductive wood of your trees. So first, you're going to focus on practices that actually don't have an impact or very little impact, potential impact on your current year yield. There are a lot of practices that you can put into place to help you increase your yields over time that actually don't reduce your yield in the current year. Most of those have to do with expanding the size of the tapping zone. So like we said before, the bigger the tapping zone, the more non-conductive wood that we have to work with in the first place. So simply by increasing drop line length, that can get a lot of work done here. Similar things with vertical movement of lateral lines. And taking this back to the results of that study that I talked about in the beginning, remember that in that study, using these tapping practices, between 27 and 40% of our trees did not have growth rates that met that minimum growth rate necessary for sustainability. But when we redid the analysis using a longer drop line, we dropped that number down from 27 to 40% to between 8 and 27% just by adding 6 inches to the drop line. So that can go a long way towards increasing the long-term yield of your trees. Okay, and then of course, tapping below the lateral line is another way to skin this cat if you have very good vacuum levels and very good sanitation. In those cases, if you have good vacuum and good sanitation, our experiments show there is no difference in yield between tapples placed above the lateral and tapples placed below the lateral. So this is another potential option for expanding that tapping zone, improving your yields over time without sacrificing your yield in the current year. Now, when things get a little bit further and you need to go further to help improve the condition of your trees, you can then adjust practices that do or can impact current year yields, like the number of taps per tree and the tapping depth and diameter. Again, taking it back to that original study, when we further looked at the analysis of both longer drop lines and a reduced tapping depth, so going from 2 inches to 1.5 inches, the number of trees that didn't have sufficient growth rates for sustainability dropped to between 1 and 11%. So our tapping practices, changes in our tapping practices can really bring about improvements in long-term sustainability, both in terms of yield and our tree health, which are ultimately essentially the same thing. Okay, so like in a real world scenario, if it were me, what I generally recommend, if you have trees that you know are not growing well or not growing at a good rate, you know that you're hitting non-conductive wood frequently, we generally say greater than 5% of the time, but I'm beginning to change, in my older age, I'm beginning to change this assessment, actually not my older age, with more data, let's say, I'm beginning to change this. I think if you're hitting it even in the 2 to 3% range, you should really be considering adjusting your practices. I'll show you why in a minute. First things first, if you've got this, then you're going to want to first look at whether you need to be doing some thinning to promote and open up and allow some space for those crop trees to grow and actually put on some conductive wood. Then you can take all those steps to increase the size of your tapping zone. Longer drop lines if it's appropriate, tapping below the lateral if it's appropriate, and probably reducing the number of taps per tree if you are, especially if you are putting those second taps in very small trees. And then finally, if necessary, move to shallower depths or a smaller diameter tap hole. If it's needed, these are appropriate steps to take. You can know about how much reduction in yield you can expect, and you can balance that with the needs that you know your trees have in terms of getting your overall yield higher. So ultimately, like I said, you're going to aim to choose tapping practices that balance the current year yields and sustainability for your tree. So tapping practices that are going to result in the maximum yields possible for the current year to maintain a sustainable level of non-conductive wood for the growth rate and health of your trees. Because basically everything that we do today for our yield is going to ultimately determine our future yields. Getting back to my comment about maybe the threshold should be lower than 5%. This is analysis that Dr. Perkins did for the Proctor Center operation. This is looking at how much money we were losing from approximately our 5,000 tap sugar bush, how much money we were losing by tapping into various levels of non-conductive wood. So when we were hitting non-conductive wood just over 4.5% of the time, we were losing 32 cents per tap hole. And this is basically as a bulk producer. And then by going to 1.5%, that dropped by more than half to 11 cents per tap hole. And going even lower gets to 3 cents per tap hole. So you can see that even going from a little above 4.5% to a little above 1.5% is a pretty significant impact on actual dollars and cents. So keep this in mind when you're looking at how often am I hitting non-conductive wood? Is it 5%? Even if it is just under 5%, that could be hitting you in the wallet pretty big time. Okay. That was a long one. I appreciate you guys hanging in there with me for that. And I think we do probably have time for a question or two.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Does anybody have any questions?
Maybe you covered this in there already. So then what's the recommended distance from the old tap hole up, down? Seems like the not conductive wood goes up and down. Left or right. Just any suggestions and she referenced that.
Yeah. Did you hear the question, Abby?
Nope.
Probably. Yeah, I'll repeat it. That's fine. So the question is, so you talked about the non-conductive wood going up and down, but what do you recommend for distance going horizontally? So tapping from year to year, what's the recommended distance, right? That going up and down over that you recommend?
That is a fantastic question. So with laterally, I would not recommend going closer than 2 inches. I get a little bit twitchy even with 2 inches because of the level of vacuum that we use, and we don't have great studies about how leaky that can be when you're going that close, but definitely no closer than 2 inches is generally what we recommend. Up and down, vertically, vertically. That is a matter of preference. So this analysis that we did assumes that you are randomly tapping the tree. And in some cases, that's what some people in a sense recommend, is to basically find old tap holes, go between 2 and 4 inches to the right or left, and maybe 6 inches above or below. That's fine. You can also mark your tap holes and do the same thing. But generally speaking, you want to keep in mind that that vertical tap hole column is probably going to be in the neighborhood of 16 inches, and you can't guarantee that it is not, it does taper, but it does not, and I don't think I have a picture in my slide. Yeah, I don't think I have it in this talk, but you never know whether it's going like this or that. So tapping, it is important to have some horizontal displacement from that tappel, in my opinion. Lots of people vary on this, but that's sort of my 2 cents about it.
That's a good question. And I think it varies from tree to tree and depends on how quick that tap hole closure is, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, if you had amazingly good growth, you might have a better feeling for how that non-conductive wood column was more deeply embedded in the, or in the tree. But again, because they're never really straight, it's very hard to predict. So having dissected hundreds and hundreds of trees and looked at how weird those stains are, I tend to edge towards a little more distance than most people would tend to recommend.
What's the definition of drop line length?
the question is, what's the definition of a drop line length?
Definition of the drop line length would be literally the length of that drop line from T to spout. Was that the question, or did I misunderstand?
So in the sustainability recommendations, going from 30 inches to 36 inches, maybe 30 centimeters off the tap. I didn't understand what drop line actually is. Tubing coming off the tap relevant to the health and sustainability of the trees.
Did you hear any of that?
No.
The question is, so I think it's just clarifying, just that you're referring to the sustainability of tapping the tree, of how does that distance of the drop line, the length of the drop line coming off the spout, how does that relevant to sustainability within the tree?
The main reason it is relevant is because it determines, right, how much area of the tree you have access to. So the longer the sap drop line, the more potential conductive wood you have to tap into. So it basically expands the possible pool of non-conductive wood, and also, so I'm getting messages from the ethers here, but basically it expands the maximum possible area of the tree that you're tapping. Am I making sense, or am I just repeating myself the same way over and over again?
Did I heard that right? Or I think, like, I'm pretty new to it, so I'm not familiar with what that measurement is relative to. Right? As I put a tap on a tree, are you telling me that the length of the hose coming off of it, is that the drop line?
Yes.
I just increase that.
Yeah. Have you used a tubing system or using buckets when you tap?
Mostly buckets.
Yeah. So on the drop line is, so in a tubing system, you have the horizontal that's connecting to all the trees.
Okay.
The drop line is what comes off of that horizontal, what we call the lateral, that goes to the spout. And so in a bucket system, that doesn't matter because you're moving around. Where that drop line, because you're kind of limited to how far that hose is, because you have a horizontal line and you can adjust that a little bit, but with you can't adjust that as much to keep the pitch if you want downhill. So that spout is connected to the drop line, is that connecting piece. And if it's really short, you can't reach far on the tree because you're kind of tethered off of that, your spout. So if it's really long, you have a lot more distance to reach. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I would add, for the bucket scenario, the same geometry is in play. It just differs. So with a bucket, you are going to want to make sure that you are maximizing the area on the trunk of that tree that you are tapping each year, which can be very tempting to not do with a bucket for a variety of reasons. But using variations in snow depth each year to your advantage, but also potentially in the right situation, going through some extra length to reach some areas of the tree that you typically would not attach a bucket to, it's really important not to focus your tapping in one narrow area of the tree, because it will end you up in a scenario like this pretty rapidly, especially for a small tree. But even this sort of reflects probably some bucket tapping that was really highly centralized and didn't move around. So for buckets, it's also important to expand and use as much of the tree's trunk as possible for sap collection.
So is there a maximum height and floor with which you should bucket tap in? Could I put a tap, say, a foot off the ground and then
With a bucket, your maximum height is going to be determined primarily by practicality. Like, you are not going to want to get on a ladder every time you empty that bucket. Like, so there are some practical limits to that. In terms of just on a tree, are there limitations to how high you can tap? I mean, again, there are practicality issues that are related to tubing too, but from a just yield perspective, the nuanced differences that we might see in terms of pressures and sap sugar concentration as we go up the tree are probably negligible in terms of what we actually get from the tree. So going higher on the trunk is not, it's more practically prohibitive than any kind of physiologically prohibitive. And certainly our friends and neighbors to the north are, because of snow depth some years, tapping at very high locations on the trees, just based on what is exposed at that moment. So yeah, I would say no. I mean, obviously, if you want to tap 30 feet up in the tree, that might be a little bit crazy, but 10 feet is probably just fine.
in regards to sustainability, would there be any rationale to put taps at, say, a 2-foot height 1 year, and then the next year bring it up to an 8-year height in regards to the general location?
Plenty of people do that. Yeah, it's and one way that is easily done is tapping below the lateral 1 year and then above the lateral the next year. And if you are using very long drop lines, so 36 is kind of where we landed on for this research. Other people at this point are recommending even longer drop lines, especially for larger trees, like 40 inches, maybe even 42 inches. But yeah, tapping, staggering, using the maximum area of your tree, exploiting, I hate to use that word, but using the maximum possible area of your tree for sap harvest is ultimately going to help the tree and your yields in the long run. There's just no question about it.
I think a lot of people even do the buckets on the ground with some tubing going into it. And you think about, if you only have 2 feet, you're that same thing, you're limited. That's that length you have as well. Question right here, you had said.
Is there a difference in scarring between 3/16 tubing on gravity versus on vacuum? Is there less scarring on?
There would only be, I heard that, yay. There is no difference in the size of the wound with vacuum and gravity sap collection. So if we're pulling 28 inches of vacuum or no vacuum, that if the hole is the same size, it's generally going to make the same size wound. It really has most to do with the size of the wound has most to do with the size of the hole, and then some other nuanced features, of course, like the genetics of the tree and stuff like that. But how carefully we remove that spout is also important too. Like, damaging bark is one of the things that causes tapple wounds to vary quite a bit. But anyway, your question, vacuum or no vacuum, does not affect the size of the wound.
Thank you.
Either one.
Regarding tapping depth, how do you account for different thicknesses in the bark You have to change your bit stopper every tree to do that?
That is in all of our studies, we have taken a more practical approach to looking at tapping depth. And because of that, we have always measured our tapping depth from the bark out. So our results account for a fairly wide variation in bark thickness. So if I'm using a 2-inch tapping depth, sometimes that's going to be 1 3/4 inches into clear sapwood. And sometimes if it's thinner bark, it will be 2 inches into clear sapwood. So personally, I would not recommend varying tapping depth based on, from tree to tree. I would, generally speaking, recommend, if you have an idea of about the approximate thickness for a particular area of woods, for example, you can make your decision based on that. But I wouldn't recommend changing it from tree to tree. Some people remove the bark before they tap. I hesitate to recommend that.
What about even like removing any like really thick bark that's flaky on the outside?
Again, I get skittish about doing that. I know that plenty of people do it and it seems to be fine. My hours spent looking at cut up trees gives me pause at doing that, even though it should be okay. I'm a little squeamish about that. Not going to tell you not to do it, but it's not going to be me saying go do it.
Back to
What is the recommendation on tree growth before you can bury it with the non-conductive wood or be able to tap area habitat?
I didn't quite hear that one, Adam.
So what's the recommendation on growth rate for?
What is the recommendation on the growth of the tree, the girth of the tree, in order to re-tap in an area that you have before? When do you bury, if you would, the non-conductive wood? What is it?
Like how?
How much bigger does the tree have to be?
If they hit that same exact area again?
Yes.
So how much growth do you need over top of an old tap hole?
Is it 2 inches? Is it 4 inches?
Well, it should definitely be at least as deep as your tackle depth, right? Like, so if you want to drill in 2 inches and you want to be really sure you're not going to tap into a buried tap hole, then it should be at least 2 inches of growth on top of that. Now, there's some wiggle room there, of course, because that stain tapers. So it should be not as close to the surface in parts of the stain as it is right where that initial tap hole wound was made. But from my perspective, it is always best to err on the side of caution there. And if you can avoid tapping directly over it, is probably always going to be the best.
What is the average increment in parts of an inch that your trees on Proctor put on every 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch?
At Proctor, very little. Proctor,
Yeah.
I'm trying to get back to that. Sorry. Gosh, this is a long presentation.
1/8 of an inch a year. I can't quite do the math, but it would take 8 years to put on an inch, 16 to put on 2 inches.
Yeah,
Oh, very slow.
it can be. And I mean, in other places, it's more than that. I'm trying to think that's percent, all my data are in percentage. But if you look here, so we have gone from sorry, I'm moving my screen around here. So in the beginning of this study, they started out at 14 inches in 2013, and now they have not even put on an inch in diameter. So that's pretty slow.
And that's why I think, going back to if they're trees that you've been tapping for years and years and years, you're probably better going to a shallower depth, right, Abby? Even if you may not, the 1.5 inches versus 2 inches, you may get less production than a 2-inch tap hole. But if you have less chance of hitting conductive wood, you might actually be better off, right? Than with vacuum leaks.
Yeah, and again, in that case, I would still defer to how often am I hitting non-conductive wood? Certainly in most cases, based on our data, I don't see any reason to recommend going beyond 2 inches from a sap yield perspective. But even with slow growth rates, if I have trees that haven't been tapped very much, for example, so I know there's not a lot of pre-existing non-conductive wood, I can feel more comfortable about a 2-inch tapping depth. It really does depend on all of those factors. It's not just growth, it's how much non-conductive wood is already there. It's how fast they're growing right now, and also how fast they were growing. It's all of those things, but certainly, we'll talk about this with red maple later on. There are some other reasons to think about tapping depth. And maybe err a little bit on the side of a little shallower.
Any other questions?
Any significance to the angle of the tap going for production and health of the tree? When it's straight or at a slight angle up or down?
So angle of the tap holes, does that impact production yields at all? So up or down, straight, level?
Yay, I actually have data and not speculation on this. Dr. Perkins did a study the past 2 years looking at the yields from a totally straight tap hole versus one with a slight angle, and found that there is no difference. So as long as you are making a clean, round tap hole, there should be no difference in yield. And I will, however, the caveat that I want to make clear there, people have their preferences, straight, a little angle. So from a yield perspective, all else being equal, there should be no difference. But if you are a straight horizontal tapper, you do need to make sure that relative to the ground, that is at least straight or with a little angle, but not down into the tree. So depending on the angle of your tree, if you're drilling a tap hole straight relative to the ground, it can inadvertently end up angled back to the tree. Those tap holes do not close well. It is not good for the tree. It will likely make a lot of that non-conductive wood. So that's my caveat with respect to tap hole angle. And that part comes from work from my generous colleagues in Quebec.
Any other questions?
A sanitation question. Is there any advantage to occasionally sanitizing your bit from multiple trees to multiple trees, dipping it in peroxide or alcohol?
While I do not have data to support yes or no to that question, it is certainly a common practice by a lot of people. And what do I want to say here?
Well, when it
It's
impacts,
good. I want to having a sanitized drill bit is good. It is not going to hurt anything to have a sanitized drill bit. And definitely, like, if you're the kind of person that likes to put it in your mouth, like, that's definitely not a good idea. But sanitizing the tap hole is, I actually do have some data from my work a long time ago that may not be a good idea. So while having a nice sanitized drill bit is good, like taking it that, I just want to be clear that taking it that step further of squirting that into the tap hole is not something that A, is allowed in the US, and B, is not something that I would recommend. And definitely don't put your spouts in your mouth.
Know that.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here, Abby.
Thanks
We-
for having me.
So just let everybody know, we have a 30-minute break. I think the workshops start back up again at